The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. I got a ton of feedback about our discussion yesterday as to the future of the bonus show. We'll talk about that a little bit later. A few stories I want to discuss with you. On the regular show today, we talked about Pittsburgh rolling out self-driving Ubers, which you can call with your smartphone, just like any Uber. It does show up with a quote, driver in the driver's seat, although that person is only there because legally you need to have someone there. You can't actually have a truly autonomous vehicle without a licensed driver there to take over. Singapore also is rolling out a test fleet in some particular areas of Singapore of a dozen or so self-driving taxis. I don't have to go over the specific logistics with you because they are very, very similar to those in Pittsburgh. You have to have someone there, a live driver able to take control behind the wheel, et cetera, et cetera. But the cultural differences of Singapore and Pittsburgh have been, we have a number of viewers and actually members in Singapore who have written to me about this. And the interesting thing, Jason, is that they were in two camps. I got some reports from Singapore saying there are people in Singapore who are just completely scared of this technology and they will not go near these cars. They think they didn't use the term something of the devil, but almost as if they have some kind of religious aversion to self-driving vehicles. At the same time, I also got a few other emails from our viewers in Singapore saying people here love it. There is such a movement here to just get rid of the driver because of, I guess, for cultural reasons that are not exactly clear to me because I'm not familiar completely with Singaporean culture. Something about not having to deal with any interaction at all with the driver is apparently very, very appealing to some areas of Singaporean society. What I'm taking away is there must be very significantly different subcultures in Singapore where you might have such positivity and negativity about this exact same technology in a relatively small country.
Yeah, that's understandable. I could see there's always going to be a divide. There's always going to be two camps of thought on anything. But something I find interesting here in the article is they say they chose Singapore because the infrastructure, supportive research, and drivers who tend to obey traffic rules.
Okay, that does not apply just to drivers and traffic rules. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Singapore is known for incredibly harsh criminal justice apparati, I'm not sure.
Apparati, I think.
So there's this culture in Singapore of you obey the law, period, because the punishments for relatively innocuous crimes are so harsh. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that that is the case. And what we were talking about, you brought up on the regular show today, this idea that when you see all of these unique circumstances in terms of requesting a lane change when you've accidentally gotten into the wrong lane and you need to cut in front of someone, how would driverless vehicles handle something like that, et cetera, et cetera. I guess if you go to a country where people, by and large, are very strictly obeying the laws, the driving laws, I guess it's a good place to test it.
Yeah, and probably somewhere here in Boston where I think we're kind of known as some of the, let's say, harshest, worst drivers, maybe called assholes, massholes in some places in the country. Yeah,
the driving in my neighborhood of South Boston is, I think, like nothing I've ever seen. Number one, tons of intersections that should have lights don't have lights. And there are many intersections where, because people are parked on both sides of the street you're trying to turn onto and both sides of the street that you're on, you have to do this thing where you very dangerously start edging out to try to see if there's oncoming traffic. I've almost gotten hit many times, and I'm inching out as slowly as possible. You need to have a light there. I mean, that's just the reality. There really should be lights there. The double parking is insane in my neighborhood of South Boston, and it tends to congregate around coffee shops. So there's one spot near where I live where there's a Dunkin' Donuts and a Starbucks next to each other, both chains that I don't go to, as I've said many times on the show, but many people do. Any morning, any weekend morning particularly, people double, even triple parked. If a fire truck needed to get through at that time, it could not get through, period. And there's this insane So South Boston is a hub of significant gentrification that's going on right now. And recently, a new Starbucks was approved in another part of the neighborhood. You had some people who are sort of like the legacy families in the neighborhood saying, we don't want another Starbucks. This is a disaster. We don't want the yuppies. We don't want the gentrifiers, the hipsters. We don't want any of it. And that's what's going to happen with a Starbucks. And then you had other sort of townies and old timers and legacy people from the city saying, you know what? I want the Starbucks because the people who are moving into the neighborhood are driving by so fast that Starbucks will bring double parking, and thus it will slow down the gentrifiers who are driving around really fast. So anyway, long story short, the driving is an absolute disaster in Boston.
Yeah, I can remember growing up learning how to drive. And, something like, get your nose out there. You're never going to get out. You got to get your nose out in traffic.
Yeah, I really do feel that if you become comfortable driving in the city of Boston, driving in most other American cities is no big deal. Although I know that in different countries, there are completely insane and crazy driving situations. There are a number of countries where this applies. Driving in New York City, I found far more straightforward than driving in Boston because, number one, at least in Manhattan, you're basically dealing with an organized grid. And people in New York City drive insanely aggressively, but it's predictably aggressive. Where in Boston, I feel like anybody could do anything at any time.
It's part of the fun, I'd say, and driving down roads where I think they're cow paths mostly with the way they're twisting and weaving through.
Circular, weird one-ways, double switchbacks, all sorts of stuff, yeah. Driving in Boston, it'll really get you up to speed on complicated driving, at least as far as U.S. cities are concerned.
Maybe the best place to stress test these new cars.
Yeah, the self-driving cars would have quite an experience here. Here's a follow-up from a story from over a year ago. A year ago, we told you about Zion Harvey, who became the first child to receive a double hand transplant after losing his hands and feet years earlier because of an infection. It's now been a year since the surgery, and doctors say he's doing well. He can throw a baseball, he can write in a journal, and he can also make himself lunch. He was 8 years old when he underwent the transplant. He is now 9 years old. He had previously also received a kidney transplant, so he was already taking the medication to avoid rejection of the kidney transplant at the time of the hand transplant, so that made him a better candidate for the hand transplant procedure. This is really amazing. I mean, we are seeing such significant advancements in so many areas of medicine over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's a simple, great story. A kid that would probably have no chance at life really without, body organs or hands, etc., gets a chance to be a positive citizen to the society.
No doubt about it. And we are going to see this type of technology develop. Opposition to this type of thing still exists. It's mostly religious, to be perfectly frank with you. It's the idea that this is humans playing God, that this is not the way God would have intended, whatever. To all people who say that, I always go back to the question of, if you truly believe that God is all-knowing and all-powerful, God allowed humans to figure out how to do this. So how can you really be angry about that? It's not my perspective, but to someone who comes to me and says, this is not natural, God created a world where this is possible. So how could you be angry? How could you say this is against what God would have wanted?
It was kind of like we were talking about yesterday with the agree to disagree kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have to let people have their beliefs and say, all right, you're so firmly entrenched here, I get it. But I know there is one other kind of yin to this yang and the whole animal rights and how these things come to being. And I can understand some people, and I'm off and on with this camp of, should we use mice and baboons, et cetera, to test these? Is it worth the amount of life that we kill to get this technology?
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I think very often there's a desire to have absolutes, sort of philosophical and moral absolutes, which is there is no objective way in which humans are superior to other species. And thus, it would not be more morally justified to do horrible testing on other species than it would be on humans. I recently have been reading a number of pieces that I found pretty convincing, which say you actually are being completely sort of subjective and arbitrary in so many areas of morality that it is not actually unique to say, you know what, as a human, I'm okay testing whatever on a mouse. I'm not okay testing it on a chimpanzee, and I'm not okay testing it on humans. And the defense is not one that argues that that's not arbitrary, but more that there's such an arbitrary nature to so many of our institutions, and we're not always questioning those. So maybe there is some legitimacy to say, it's okay to feel like the testing on mice is all right, but the testing on chimps is not. I don't know. I'm not sure if that resonates with you at all.
I have an example where I was actually shooting a series of documentaries for a certain university, and I was actually in labs where they were testing on mice, and there were some certain weird things that went on where these people were doing kind of microscopic adjustments of implements with mice's brains open and attaching wires to neurons. But the weird thing to me was that they had these kind of cartoonish figures of mice everywhere around them, and this kind of speaks to your point where, they're in there doing this kind of somewhat brutal act to this animal, even though it's feeling no pain, etc. But at the same time, they're kind of disconnect from it, and they think it's almost like a cartoon. They had names for them, and it actually quit the job because it weirded me out so much, to be honest.
So if I understand what you're saying, they had sort of these drawings of mice around, which you felt were sort of to cartoonize the subjects of their experiment and maybe feel less bad about it. Like this is more, I associate this more with a cartoon than I do with a real animal that feels pain.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like they had to do something. Maybe that was their own way of disconnecting from the situation.
Probably.
But at the same time, I'm sure they're kind of like what you're talking about. They feel that the mice are in some subsect of animal genealogy, I guess, for lack of a better term, that it's okay to do whatever we want. But at the same time, I assume they're doing the same thing. The next floor up was the chimp lab, not chimps, they can't use chimp anymore. It's some other small primate.
Yeah.
But I almost assume the same thing was going on there.
Yeah. I also have this tendency to want moral absolutes. So I say, if we don't test on animals, we don't test on animals because of what it implies, not based on how intelligent or whatever we feel the animal to be relative to us. And the same thing is often applied to the ideas of what animals different people choose to eat. And I don't know, I've recently, the literature I've been looking at makes me sort of more okay with the seemingly arbitrary, the seemingly and actually arbitrary nature of many of these decisions that we make. But I know many people particularly in our membership, have very strong feelings about this, and I anticipate hearing from some of them. Real quick, we talked yesterday about the future of the bonus show. Do you want call-ins during the bonus show for members only? Do you want interviews during the bonus show, et cetera, et cetera? Generally speaking, I received maybe about, 40 or 50 different notes about this through different means. The general gist is people like what we're doing. They like the idea of the bonus show is somewhere between 2 and 4 stories that you might not hear on the regular show. They might be more niche oriented relative to, the more general appeal of what you might hear on the regular show. People generally like the idea that Jason will pick some stories, that I will pick some stories. When Rachel is here, she's been picking 1 or 2 of the bonus show stories. People like that. Interviews, the consensus was yes, if it's something that really wouldn't fit on the regular show and every once in a while. So I think there's definitely something to that. Adding call-ins, generally the reception was positive from people. Multiple people said what I would like if you're going to do call-ins on the bonus show is that you do them at a different time, because for many people, the regular call-in time on the show is like in the middle of their workday and it doesn't work too well. I get that. Based on when we record stuff and when we upload it and get it out to you, we can't drastically change when we would take calls, but in late September, we're going to be slightly pushing back the production time of the show. It shouldn't really affect when members get it. It might by a half hour or so. We're still sort of working that out. But it might allow us to take calls at, maybe 2:30 Eastern instead of 1:15. I don't know if it would help people who are trying to call in, but that's the big picture of the feedback we got.
I actually got my first email of the show from a viewer, one JR from Utah.
Okay.
Commented on what we were talking about yesterday about, guess the guy in Utah was actually named Tim DeChristopher, and he is kind of a local legend now for his actions.
So to reset for people who may not have listened yesterday, you talked about a guy in Utah who got in trouble for buying land rights and then not actually paying for it. And his idea was to protect the land and prevent it from being developed by oil companies. And you just mentioned a guy in Utah, and someone in our audience actually knew specifically about the story and sent us an article about it.
Yeah, he suggested that maybe we do an article or a segment about it.
Yeah, I actually would love to interview the guy. I read he's now out of prison, so maybe he's gettable.
Yeah, I think he is. He's out there. I think he would want to talk to us.
One other thing, and this is something just to give people a little peek behind the curtain. I received an email from someone saying, David, you should try to get Julian Assange on the program, that he is gettable and he seems to do independent shows. And I would just assume he's not gettable. I think that would be absolutely huge. And if we can get him, my sense is you'd probably be able to suss out a few ways of trying to get in touch with them through their PR agency, through WikiLeaks, whatever. That would be absolutely huge. And that would definitely be what we call internally a two-parter.
Can we get him to actually leak something for the first time on our show? That's a real question.
If he did, it would go against what he says is their policy, which is they don't strategically hold anything to leak at a particular time or in a particular way. His argument is we put stuff out once we've redacted sensitive information, period. So I don't know. If you believe that, then he wouldn't have anything to leak if we were able to get him for an interview.
Maybe we get lucky. We get on the right day.
Yeah, we have to be like, when do you plan to be ready to leak something that has just been redacted? Okay, so that's the bonus show today. Keep the ideas coming. Thanks to everybody for the feedback.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.